Republican River breaks, Nebraska, October 1905. The autumn air was sharp, carrying the scent of dust and distant wood smoke. On a low rise overlooking the shallow, braided river, a half-dozen men stood with their hands in their pockets, watching a strange and, to their eyes, deeply foolish spectacle. An old brick silo, a relic of some failed farming venture from the 1880s, stood skeletal against the vast sky. Its mortar was crumbling, its upper courses were shattered, and a jagged crack ran down its northern face like a lightning scar. It was a ruin, fit only for pigeons and the wind. Inside this ruin, a man was building a house. Luka Babic, a quiet Croatian with hands as thick and calloused as oak bark, was methodically bolting together the curved steel ribs of a Quonset hut. The metallic rasp of his wrench echoed from the curved brick walls. The structure taking shape within the silo was noticeably smaller, a metal tube being squeezed inside a clay one. Emery Sloan, the region's best grain elevator repairman, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dry grass. He knew structures. He knew how they failed. "He's building his own tomb," Sloan declared to the others, a man named Jedediah Mills, and the Finch brothers, Thomas and Arthur. "That brick is spalled to hell and back. First big sleet. It'll soak up water like a sponge, and he'll be living inside a pillar of ice. It's the craziest thing I've ever seen a man do." The others murmured in agreement. It was one thing to be poor and make do, another to be a damn fool inviting winter into your home. They saw a man sealing his family into a guaranteed failure, a damp, cold crypt disguised as a house. What did this Croatian lime kiln mason, a man who had spent his life not building houses but firing stone into powder, understand about thermal buffering that a professional grain elevator repairman, an expert in prairie structures, had so completely missed? Before we unpack the precise physics that made this ruined silo one of the warmest homes in Nebraska, I want to invite you to join our community of historical problem solvers. If you enjoy stories about practical genius and forgotten wisdom, subscribe to this channel and ring the bell so you don't miss an episode. I promise you will learn the simple, powerful science behind this innovation. And let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional solution you've ever seen for a common problem? Luka Babic was not a carpenter. He had never framed a wall, shingled a roof, or chinked a log cabin. He was not a farmer, and his attempts to coax corn from the dry Nebraska soil had been discouraging at best. He was a pechar, a kiln builder from the Dalmatian coast, a man whose trade was the mastery of contained fire. His hands knew the heft of limestone, the texture of refractory clay, and the precise curve of a furnace arch. He had spent 2 decades building and operating massive double-shelled lime kilns that dotted the Adriatic hillsides. These were not simple ovens. They were sophisticated thermal engines, designed to reach 1,650 degrees Fahrenheit and then hold that heat for days, slowly, perfectly calcining the rock within. The secret was always the same: one shell to face the fire and another outer shell to face the world, with a carefully measured gap of air between them. The air was the true wall. The air was what held the heat. He had brought his wife, Annika, and their 2 children, 7-year-old Stjepan and 5-year-old Jelena, to America for the promise of land. But the land came with a price he hadn't fully understood until their first winter in a rented sod dugout. That winter of 1904 was a brutal education in a kind of cold he'd never known. On the Adriatic, the winter was a damp chill managed with a small brazier. Here, the cold was an active, predatory force. He remembered the feeling of his tin coffee cup sticking to his wet woolen gloves, tearing the fabric when he tried to pull it free. He remembered the black crust of lamp soot that grew on the low rafters, a sign of a fire burning constantly, inefficiently, just to stay alive. Most vividly, he remembered the basin of wash water Annika would set on the table for the children before their meager supper. By the time the meal was over, a white film of ice would have already crept across its surface. They slept in their coats, their breath pluming in the dark, and woke up colder than when they went to sleep. He had failed to keep them warm. It was a failure he would not repeat. He would not fight the Nebraska winter. He would trick it. The problem with the conventional frontier home, whether it was a log cabin, a sod house, or a clapboard shack, was its direct exposure. The standard construction philosophy was one of brute force, a single, thick wall to stand against the elements. But the Nebraska winter didn't just push, it pulled. The relentless prairie wind was a thief, stripping away heat by force. This process, convection, was the primary enemy. A 20-mile-per-hour wind at 0 degrees Fahrenheit has the same cooling effect on a surface as minus 22 degrees in still air. The wind scoured the outer walls of his neighbors' homes, carrying away precious BTUs of heat as fast as their stoves could produce them. Jedediah Mills, a good man with a fine, sturdy-looking cabin, would burn through a cord of cottonwood every 2 weeks in the depths of winter, yet his wife still complained that the floor was too cold to stand on without shoes. The second enemy was conduction. The wood, sod, or stone of the walls was a direct bridge from the warmth inside to the cold outside. Heat energy naturally flows toward cold, and a single solid wall was a superhighway for its escape. Frost would form on the inside of the walls, tracing the lines of the nails and studs where the cold was conducted most efficiently. The Finch brothers spent their days stuffing rags into every crack and crevice, fighting a losing battle against infiltration. They were trying to plug 1,000 tiny holes in a structure that was, by its very design, one giant leak. These men were experienced builders, following proven methods. Their homes were strong, well-built, and fatally inefficient. They were fighting the cold on its own terms, a war of attrition they could never win. They saw Luca's crumbling silo as an even weaker version of their own failed fortresses. They couldn't see that Luca wasn't building a fortress at all. Luca had purchased the abandoned silo and the 2 acres it sat on for $12. The seller thought he was taking advantage of a greenhorn immigrant. The structure was a 24-foot diameter cylinder of brick, rising 30 feet high. After clearing out decades of accumulated debris and pigeon droppings, Luca began his work not on the silo, but inside it. He poured a level concrete floor, a strange luxury on the prairie, embedding into it the footing plates for his true home. Then came the Quonset, a kit of corrugated steel panels and ribs he'd bought from a catalog. To his neighbors, it was baffling. Why buy a metal building only to hide it inside a brick one? Day by day, the metal arch rose inside the brick circle. Luca was meticulous. He had measured everything twice. The Quonset had a diameter of 20 feet. This left a precise 2-foot gap, an unbroken ring of air, between the outer face of his steel home and the inner face of the brick silo. This was not a random leftover space. It was the most important room in the house, though no one would ever enter it. Emery Sloan stopped by again in November as Luca was fitting the final steel panels into place. The air had a sharp bite now, a promise of what was to come. Sloan gestured with his chin at the long, vertical crack in the silo's outer wall. "I've been thinking on this, Bobbich," he said, his tone that of a man offering a final, friendly warning. "When the sleet comes, that crack and all those missing mortar joints are going to draw water right in. It'll run down the inside of that brick and pool at the bottom. The ground will freeze solid, and all that meltwater from the sunny side will have nowhere to go. You're building your house in an ice cellar. The damp will kill you before the cold does." It was a professional's diagnosis, rooted in experience, and it was entirely logical. Luca paused, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at the crack, then at the 2-foot air gap. "The water will not touch us," he said quietly. He pointed to a series of small, half-inch weep holes he had drilled through the base of the brick silo, angled downward to the outside. "It has a way out." He then turned back to his work, tightening a bolt with a decisive squeal of metal on metal. The conversation was over. His wife, Annika, watched from the temporary shelter they'd built nearby. She brought him his lunch of bread and dried sausage. "It looks like a turtle in a broken pot, Luca," she said, her voice holding a mixture of trust and bewilderment. Luca smiled, a rare sight. He tapped the warm, sunlit steel of the Quonset shell. "A warm turtle," he replied. "The pot can break. The turtle will be safe." Before winter sealed them in, he completed the final critical step. He used salvaged lumber and tar paper to build a cap over the top of the 2-foot air gap, sealing it off from the sky. He fashioned a simple double-walled flue for his small cast-iron stove that passed through the Quonset roof and the silo roof, ensuring the air buffer remained an unbroken, trapped cylinder. He had not repaired the silo. He had recruited it. To understand the genius of what Luka Babic had built, you have to understand the 3 ways heat moves: conduction, convection, and radiation. His neighbors' homes were losing a battle against all 3. Luka's silo house defeated them in order. The first line of defense was the brick silo itself. This was the sacrificial wall. It was meant to fail, but to fail in a useful way. When the bitter north wind slammed into the Republican River breaks, it didn't hit Luka's living space. It hit a 30-foot-tall, 24-foot-wide cylinder of crumbling brick. The silo acted as a massive windbreak, dissipating the kinetic energy of the wind. The air inside the 2-foot buffer zone was never touched by the gales outside. It remained perfectly still. By eliminating the wind, Luka had single-handedly defeated the worst of the convective heat loss, the wind chill factor. The outer surface of his Quonset hut would only ever be exposed to the ambient air temperature, not the far more brutal effective temperature of a windswept plain. This still air in the buffer zone was the heart of the system. Air is a poor conductor of heat, as long as it isn't moving. If the gap had been too wide, say 7 or 8 feet, the air inside would have begun to circulate. The air against the cold brick would have cooled, sunk, and been replaced by warmer air from near the Quonset, creating a convective loop that would have constantly shuttled heat from his inner wall to the cold outer wall. But a 2-foot gap was narrow enough to largely prevent this. The air stratified and became a near-perfect blanket of insulation. It was the same principle as the double-pane windows that wouldn't become common for another 50 years. Luka had built a double-pane house. The second opponent, conduction, was stopped cold at the air gap. The only physical connections between his warm interior and the frozen exterior were the concrete floor and the small stove flue. The steel walls of his home were not physically touching the frozen brick of the silo. The heat from his stove warmed the air inside the Quonset. That warmth would conduct through the steel walls, but then it hit the 2-foot buffer of still, insulating air. It couldn't bridge the gap. The temperature of the air in the buffer zone would settle somewhere between the 70 degrees inside the Quonset and the minus 20 degrees outside, creating a far less steep thermal gradient. Instead of losing thousands of BTUs per hour, he would lose mere hundreds. Finally, there was radiation. Heat radiates from warm surfaces to cold ones. Inside a normal cabin, your body radiates heat toward the cold walls, making you feel chilled even if the air is warm. But inside the Quonset, the interior curved walls were all at a uniform, warm temperature. The living space was a cocoon of radiant warmth. The entire system was a masterpiece of thermal buffering. The outer silo absorbed the wild, violent swings of the prairie winter, smoothing them out. The air gap insulated. and the inner shell provided a stable, comfortable, and remarkably efficient home. The cracked, ruined silo wasn't a liability, it was an asset. Its imperfections didn't matter, because its only job was to stand there and take a beating from the wind. That January, the Platte Basin prairie freeze arrived. It was not a storm, but a siege. For 8 consecutive nights, the temperature plunged below -28 degrees Fahrenheit. The days were scarcely warmer, struggling to reach -10 degrees Fahrenheit. A relentless, fine-grained sleet, driven by a steady 30-mile-per-hour wind, coated every surface in a growing armor of opaque ice. Trees cracked like rifle shots in the night. Livestock froze, standing in their pens, if not given shelter. It was a winter that broke thermometers and spirits. Inside Jedediah Mill's cabin, the family lived in a shrinking circle of misery around their pot-bellied stove, which glowed a dull cherry red. They had moved all their furniture into one room. They stuffed coats and blankets against the door and windows. Still, the cold crept in. Frost furred the nail heads on the interior walls, and a thick layer of ice glazed the bottom foot of the door. They were burning through their woodpile at a terrifying rate. The fuel meant to last until March, now looking like it wouldn't last through February. 2 miles away, inside the metal tube within the broken pot, life was unnervingly normal. Luka Babic fed his small stove only a few pieces of cottonwood at a time. The fire was never roaring, merely breathing. There were no cold spots in their single large room. Anika sat at their small table, mending one of Stjepan's shirts by the steady, unflickering light of a kerosene lamp. The flame was calm because there were no drafts. Stjepan and Yelena were on the floor, which was covered by a simple canvas ground cloth over the concrete, drawing pictures of horses on scraps of wrapping paper. They wore simple wool sweaters, not their heavy coats. On a small shelf, a basin of water for washing sat perfectly clear and liquid. The air was still and clean, smelling faintly of the stew Annika was keeping warm on the back of the stove. They had defeated the cold so completely that it had ceased to be a presence in their lives. It was just weather. Something happening to the world outside their 2-foot buffer of still air. The howling of the wind was a distant, muffled sound, a story about someone else's trouble. When the freeze finally broke, a Chinook wind swept down from the mountains, and the temperature climbed 40 degrees in a single day. The great thaw began, and with it, the accounting of the damage. Emery Sloan was on horseback, riding a circuit to check on the grain elevators and other large structures that were his responsibility. The rapid shift in temperature was brutal on buildings. Ice-laden roofs failed, and foundations cracked. He rode with a grim sense of purpose, tallying the winter's toll. His route took him along the ridge overlooking the Republican River, past the string of abandoned silos. From a distance, they were a uniform sight, each one plastered in a thick, white cocoon of wind-driven sleet and frost. They looked like giant frozen pillars, all except one. He reined in his horse, confused. Luka Babic's silo was different. While the others were still uniformly white, Luka's was patchy. The bottom 2/3 were still encased in ice, but the top third, a ring about 10 feet high, was dark, wet brick. As he watched, a steady drip of meltwater fell from the shattered upper course. The sun was hitting all the silos equally, yet this one was thawing from the top down. He looked toward the chimney pipe poking through the silo's roof. A wisp of smoke, thin and almost transparent, rose into the air. It wasn't the thick, panicked plume of a desperate fire fighting for its life. It was the slow, calm exhalation of a fire at rest. His professional curiosity, the part of him that had to understand how things worked and why they broke, overwhelmed his skepticism. This didn't make sense. A structure losing that much heat from its top should have been the coldest in the county, a chimney sucking warmth out. But the gentle smoke told a different story. He dismounted and walked toward the silo, his boots crunching in the crusty snow. He didn't knock on the door. He began by inspecting the exterior. Like a doctor examining a patient, he ran a bare hand over the lower bricks. They were cased in ice, as cold as stone. He looked up at the dripping top section. Some internal warmth had to be causing that melt. He walked around the circumference until he found the spot where a chunk of the outer wall had fallen away, creating a deep recess. Tucked inside were the remnants of a pigeon's nest. He reached into it. The twigs were sodden, dripping with runoff from the bricks above. It was just as he had predicted. The compromised wall was wicking water. Just then, Luca emerged from the door, not with a triumphant smirk, but with the same quiet composure he always wore. He gave Sloane a simple nod. "Babbage," Sloane said, his voice rough. "That wall is wet. I was right about that." "Yes," Luca said, "the pot is wet." Sloane gestured toward the door. "I need to see inside." Luca stepped aside. Sloane braced himself for the wave of damp, chilling air he knew must be waiting, the smell of mildew and rot he associated with basements and cellars. He stepped across the threshold. The air that met him was not cold. It was not damp. It was a calm, steady, dry warmth that settled on his skin like a blanket. He stopped, stunned, letting the sensation register. His face, chapped and raw from the wind, felt soothed. He looked around the clean, bright space. He saw the sleeping children in a small cot, the tidy kitchen area, the placid flame of the lamp. Then his eyes fell on the inner wall of the Quonset, the curved steel just an arm's length away. Pinned to it with a small tack was a sheet of paper, a ledger for seed inventory, its columns neatly ruled in pencil. In any other house in the county, after a week of being pinned to a wall that was the only thing between the living and the dead, that paper would have been curled into a tight tube, its fibers swollen with frost and damp. But this sheet was perfectly, impossibly flat. It was as dry as the day it was made. The sight of that simple, uncurled piece of paper broke something in Emery Sloane's certainty. The damp pigeon's nest outside and the dry paper inside were two facts that could not exist in his world. He reached out and touched the steel wall with the back of his hand. He expected a biting cold. It was cool, but not cold. It felt like the wall of a house on a mild autumn day. He turned to Luca, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning respect. He finally understood. The wet, crumbling brick wall wasn't the house's wall. It was a coat, a big, ugly, broken coat. And it was doing its job perfectly. "My God, Babbage," Sloane whispered, the words catching in his throat. "You didn't build a house. You built a calm day in the middle of a storm." Emery Sloane became the innovation's most powerful advocate. As a grain elevator repairman, he talked to farmers, ranchers, and county officials all day. He explained the principle not as the work of an eccentric immigrant, but with the authority of a structural expert who had seen the proof with his own eyes. He told people about the 2-foot air gap, the minimal fire, and the flat piece of paper on the wall. That spring, Arthur Finch, the county grain inspector and one of the men who had watched Luca build, came by on official business. Sloane made sure he went inside the silo. Finch, a practical man, immediately saw the applications beyond human comfort. A structure that could keep a piece of paper dry through a Platte Basin freeze could certainly protect seed grain from moisture and winter kill. He spent an hour with Luca, sketching a cross-section of the silo home in his notebook. That fall, the sketch and a detailed explanation of the Babbage double-wall silo were published in the Nebraska Farmers Cooperative Bulletin, distributed across the state. By 1907, more than a dozen families, tired of fighting the winter, had adopted the design, converting old silos or building new double-walled structures from scratch. The reports that came back were unanimous: fuel savings of over 60%, and a level of comfort the prairie had never known. What Luka Babic did with his knowledge of Adriatic kilns was to anticipate the core principles of modern building science by nearly a century. Today, we call his outer silo a rain screen or a sacrificial weather envelope. We call his 2-foot air gap a thermal break, and the entire concept double envelope construction. These are advanced techniques employed by high-end architects to create ultra-efficient buildings. Luka Babic, with nothing more than his hands, his memory of an ancient trade, and the motivation of a father who refused to let his children be cold, engineered a perfect solution from the ruins he found on a windswept hill. There is a philosophy hidden in the physics of that silo. The frontier rewarded what was obvious: the thickest logs, the strongest beams, the biggest fire. It was a culture of brute force, of meeting a harsh reality with overwhelming strength. Luka's genius was quieter. He didn't build a stronger wall, he built a smarter space. He hid warmth inside ruins so completely that the cold never understood where to enter. The crumbling brick silo, a symbol of failure to everyone else, became a brilliant disguise. The cold spent its fury on the broken outer wall, battering a structure that had already been abandoned, while just 2 feet away life continued in uninterrupted, ordinary peace. It proved that sometimes the most effective shield is not one that fights back, but one that makes the thing you are trying to protect invisible to the threat itself. If you found this story of hidden ingenuity and the triumph of quiet wisdom compelling, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of forgotten history. And tell us in the comments, what other modern technologies do you think have their roots in old, traditional knowledge? We appreciate your support. The video you have just watched presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, while the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Should you wish to apply any of these concepts, please consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.